America is in real trouble. For the last few years, my opponent has been at the forefront of those warning against the death of modern liberalism and that far-right populist Trumpism is taking this country in a very dangerous direction, towards authoritarianism, even dictatorship. But Mr. Kristol, you and David Brooks promised us national greatness. You said America needed to be called to their, quote, grand destiny, quote, nationalism. We needed, quote, national strength and moral assertiveness abroad, advancing the cause of freedom around the world. We needed a big project we could all do together. As Brooks' friend Christopher Beam wrote, invading Iraq, quote, suited his quest and yours for this greatness. In his 1996 article, Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy, arguing for benevolent global hegemony, my opponent wrote that John Quincy Adams was wrong that the U.S. should not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy. Why not? He asked. For the exact reasons that Quincy Adams delineated. Our principles would turn from liberty to force. We would become the dictatress of the world, but no longer the ruler of our own spirit, he said. Adams was right. The wars did not make America great. The wars. 3,000 people were killed on September 11th, 2001. As Paul Wolfowitz admitted, the main reason Osama bin Laden cited for attacking America was the U.S. military bases left in Saudi Arabia for the so-called dual containment policy against Iraq and Iran in the 1990s after Iraq War I, the Persian Gulf War. Bin Laden's plan was to provoke the United States into invading Afghanistan so he could replicate the Mujahideen's earlier success against the USSR with U.S. support in the 1980s, this time against us, to bog us down, bleed us to bankruptcy, and create a choking life for the American people under the tyranny of our security state. And after the last 20 years of war in Afghanistan and across the Middle East, we have less influence there than ever before. A $30 trillion national debt, an increasingly invasive surveillance state and militarized police state, almost 7,000 dead troops, 37,000 if you count those who killed themselves in the aftermath, and the worst partisan, political, racial, and other social division of my lifetime anyway. I'm 45. So much of this crisis is directly due to the costs, financial and otherwise, of America's Middle East regime change wars. Let's review some recent regime changes and their consequences. Note that in neoconservative doctrine, democracy absolutely must be spread to Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, but not Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Oman, Egypt, or Pakistan. And if there's a democratically elected government that our government doesn't like, the U.S. won't hesitate to try to overthrow it, like in Algeria in 1993, Gaza in 2007, Egypt in 2013, and Ukraine in 2004 and 2014. Now, to the regime changes. I'm sorry I have to skip Kosovo and Somalia for time. First on our list is President Carter and Reagan's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s to overthrow the communist regime there. This led directly to the rise of Haqqani, Hekmatyar, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Carter and Reagan's support for Saddam Hussein's Iraq in its 1980s war to overthrow the Ayatollah in Iran also backfired. It solidified the mullah's power in Persia and led directly to the so-called Gulf War after Iraq invaded Kuwait in a dispute over debts from the war against Iran. As mentioned, America's first Iraq War, launched to restore the Kuwaiti monarchy in 1991, led directly to the dual containment policy against Iraq and Iran from military bases in Saudi Arabia and al-Qaeda's war against the United States. Since 2001, after failing to deploy enough reinforcements to capture or kill bin Laden at Tora Bora or allow the Delta Force to pursue him into Pakistan, the Bush administration instead sought regime change against the Taliban in Kabul, who Bill Clinton had supported just a few years before in their own regime change against the Mujahideen warlords whom Presidents Carter and Reagan had supported against the communists in the 1980s. This led to 20 years of war, including a massive so-called surge escalation halfway through for absolutely nothing. and leading to the Taliban walking right back into power as the U.S. withdrew in the summer of 2021. Saddam Hussein in Iraq War II. When David Wurmser wrote his clean break plan for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's first government in 1996, he acknowledged that targeting secularist dictators, Hussein and Assad, for regime change in Iraq and Syria could further fan the flames of Islamist anti-American terrorism. But he said the solution to that problem would just have to wait until the war against them was over. Maybe in 1996, this was somehow understandable, from a hawk's perspective at least. According to Richard Schultz in the Weekly Standard, in the 1990s, the Pentagon Joint Staff would repeat as cliche that, quote, terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower. But after the African embassy bombings of 1998, the USS Cole attack in 2000, and September 11th, which killed nearly 3,000 people in New York and at the Pentagon, it was less understandable. Yet the neoconservatives, led by Mr. Kristol, persisted. The neocons' best laid plans to empower Jordan and compliant Shiites to take over Iraq failed. The American invasion of 2003 empowered Iran's favored factions among the Shiites, the Supreme Islamic Council and Dawa Party. In fact, it was King Abdullah of Jordan who coined the phrase Shiite crescent to describe Iran's newly enhanced power just after the invasion. Clean break, nothing. This American Shiite alliance pushed their Sunni Arab enemies out of Baghdad and into the arms of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which did not even exist before the war, adding thousands of hardened fighters to Osama bin Laden's movement, including thousands of foreign fighters who traveled there to fight against the U.S. Shiite alliance. Many of these men later went home to Libya, Syria, and Yemen to get ready for the next wars there. The U.S. took their side in all three. In Libya, the Hawks said they had to intervene to overthrow secular dictator Gaddafi to protect the poor civilians. But at the very least, tens of thousands of people have been killed in endless fighting in that country in the decades since. Bin Ladenite groups, veterans of the Second Iraq War, led that revolt and have thrived in the meantime as civil war has raged for years. Some warlords brought back literal chattel slavery of sub-Saharan Africans. Thousands of refugees drowned in the Mediterranean. The war spread from Libya into Mali, Chad, Niger, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. Obama's and allied support for the bin Ladenite revolt against the secular government in Syria, an attempt to weaken their ally Iran after the Iraq War had done so much to empower them, led to the rise of the Islamic State so-called caliphate in eastern Syria and western Iraq, and then the Third Iraq War from 2014 to 2018 to then destroy it. On behalf of those same Iranian-backed Shiite groups, the Hawks wish they hadn't fought the Second Iraq War for. No, the U.S. should not back these dictators, like so-called President Sisi in Egypt. That's part of what got us attacked in the first place. But we sure as hell should not be supporting bin Ladenite insurgencies against them either. Hillary Clinton and Saudi Arabia's installation of Mansour Hadi when they co-opted the Arab Spring revolt in Yemen in 2011 and 12 led straight to the next phase of the war, which broke out in 2015. For the last 6.5 years, the U.S. has backed Saudi Arabia and UAE in a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and also strengthened al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula beyond belief. There are now something like 30,000 bin Ladenite fighters in the world. And Iran and Russia, who intervened to save Assad from al-Qaeda and ISIS, are more influential in the region than ever. This is not how it was supposed to be. Speaking of Russia, it isn't just the Mideast wars. In Georgia, the U.S. supported the Rose Revolution of 2003 and the installation of Mikhail Saakashvili, who almost got us into a war with Russia when he attacked their peacekeeping forces in South Ossetia just 5 years later, and Vice President Cheney urged George Bush to strike Russian forces coming across the Caucasus Mountains. The U.S. also helped to overthrow the government of Ukraine twice, in 2004 and 2014. In 2014, they used actual Nazis in a street putsch against the elected government. It was supposed to be easy to get away with while Putin was distracted with the Sochi Olympics. But instead, the new Ukraine coup junta lost Crimea to Russia and started a brutal war in the east, which has killed more than 10,000 people and unnecessarily ratcheted up tensions with the other most powerful nuclear weapons state on the planet. Then National Endowment for Democracy head Carl Gershman even threatened regime change in Moscow itself in the Washington Post in October 2013. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton famously blessed the Honduran coup of 2009, leading directly to the rise of murderous drug cartels in that country and a massive child refugee crisis at our southern border. The American establishment had its so-called unipolar moment at the high water mark of U.S. influence to lead the world into the brave new future at the turn of the millennium, and they blew it. The U.S. government has spread not liberty, but the tyranny of the majority. Not free markets, but corrupt crony contracting. Not peace and security, but mass sectarian violence and destabilization. This has led to increased support for left and right-wing socialism around the world in reaction. Liberalism and democracy, in the broadest sense, have been discredited as meaning nothing more than supplication to American demands or cheap excuses for our violent intervention. The economic crisis and refugee crisis resulting from our Middle East wars has led to the rise of the populist right in Europe, where they are ascendant in the European Parliament. The UK has left the EU, and the unraveling of the entire so-called liberal international order, even in the West, has begun. In your 1997 National Greatness piece in the Wall Street Journal, you wrote that the universal principle at the heart of the American ideal is a mandate to, quote, advance freedom, end quote, around the world, apparently by any means necessary for the world's own good. But means determine ends. And even if somehow waging violent coups and regime change wars across the planet could guarantee freedom for those people, it would necessarily come at the expense of those whose lives and liberty our government is actually sworn to protect. Ours. No wonder that here in America as well, people are moving to the socialist left and nationalist right, since the disastrous consequences of militarism and regime change are what passes for liberalism in the center. The backlash from Bush's disastrous wars and the devastating economic crash of 2008, a direct result of the Fed's militarism-friendly, easy money policy in the preceding decade, led to the disruptive and destabilizing presidency of Barack Obama. His disastrous wars and the so-called K-shaped economic recovery of his time in office, meaning bankers and think tankers paid by defense contractors did great, while the people on the bottom three-quarters of the economic ladder remained stuck in 2009, led directly to the election of Donald J. Trump, running as an economic populist and war skeptic over W. Bush's brother and Barack Obama's Secretary of State. His election was a reaction against the military and economic legacy of the preceding 15 years and its central liberal establishment champions, including the neoconservatives. And who? A guy who built his political capital proclaiming on talk radio that Obama was a secret pro-terrorist Muslim from Kenya. In other words, your nemesis, Trump, was exploiting your movement's previous cultivation of this sort of illiberal sentiment among Republican voters back when it was still useful to your ends, building support for the wars. Now that the anti-Muslim chauvinism of the American right is no longer useful, you claim the right itself is now the greatest threat to democracy. If so, this is the nationalist movement the neoconservatives have done so much to cultivate and promote. For bin Laden and his friends were few, but would-be enemies who happened to be Muslim were many. So Bush and the neocons supported the worst sort of right-wing populist nationalism in America, especially with their wink and nod approach to the Muslim-hating hacks on AM talk radio. It was central to Karl Rove's plan for his permanent Republican majority. That was a big part of why my opponent was so determined to bring Sarah Palin on board with John McCain in 2008. She could get the rubes excited and afraid and keep them and convince them to continue to support the McCainian neoconservative doctrines behind the long war in the Middle East. It's why your friend Frank Gaffney pretended to believe that a small Sufi mosque in a building down the street from the old World Trade Center site was supposed to represent the Muslim enemy's triumph over America, or that the 50 states needed to pass emergency legislation to protect us all from enslavement under Sharia law. This deliberately deceptive campaign did much to make the right worse. Now the centrists are terrified of the populist right, accusing them all of being neo-Nazi white supremacists, including many tens or hundreds of thousands of men and women who are resentful veterans of the wars you lied them into. And in turn, the populist right is terrified that the war on terrorism is now being turned against them as the Department of Homeland Security redefines violent extremism to mean almost any political activity outside of the two major parties. The people, in return, resent the power of the establishment, which so despises them even more. And now, the average guy is supposed to believe that the last quarter century's greatest proponents of American empire, such as Mr. Kristol and Dick Cheney's daughter Liz, herself an avowed hawk and promoter of torture, are the last principal defenders of the old republic they destroyed. Who's buying that? Engagement, leadership, primacy, preeminence, hegemony. These are just euphemisms for world empire, with the USA in the position of the hated British that our forebears had led the world in overthrowing. The doctrine that the middle part of North America should be or could be the dominant military and political power in Eurasia and indefinitely is crazy on its face. And plus, the whole thing is really just a racket. As the soldiers call it, a self-licking ice cream cone. In other words, a government program creating its own disasters it must then attempt to solve. No nation on earth threatens the United States. As Ron Paul once told the Washington Post, we could defend this country with a couple of good submarines. The U.S. Constitution does not authorize this posture of global dominance. The people of the world do not want it. The American people's costs are in the trillions, and our gain is non-existent. We suffer the terribly destructive, inflation-generated boom-bust cycle and endlessly rising prices. The feds rifle through our internet and phone records. Our sheriff's deputies act like special operations forces at war in our neighborhoods.
Your time's up, Scott. Good. Yeah. Good. One more second. Go again. Yeah, one more sentence.
Sorry, I'm almost done.
Oh, well.
Our sheriff's deputies act like special operations forces at war in our neighborhoods. Our soldiers and Marines come home maimed physically and mentally, and more terrorists are motivated to attack the United States. There's a widespread feeling in America that liberty, justice, fairness under law, and cooperation and compromise through little d democracy is now untenable. Hatreds between sectors of society have become much more solidified. More people speak of secession and separation. The people are finding out the hard way that you cannot have it both ways. There is no such thing as a limited constitutional world empire. There cannot be a balanced budget, a free and prosperous economy, independent major media, or a rule of law in a state of permanent war. Yeah, okay. We Americans, I'm almost done. Give me just a sec. We Americans are losing our freedom in the name of forcibly spreading it to the rest of the world. Enough already. Let's defend America first, end all aggressive wars and covert interventions in other nations, abandon our empire, and put the protection of liberty in our own country at the top of our political priorities. Then, shed of all this violent hypocrisy, we will be able to lead the world in the only legitimate way we can, by the benign sympathy of our example. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
And sorry for going over.
Bill Kristol, you get an extra 2 minutes for your rebuttal.